Hello, everyone, and welcome to Healthy at Work. My name is Catherine Wilcox, a workplace health specialist with a big passion for helping people thrive at work. From the home office to the corporate office, from the assembly line to the front line, I've got you covered here for your healthiest life at work. Now let's dive into today's show. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Healthy at Work. I'm your host, Catherine, and this week's episode is dedicated to Pink Shirt Day. Now, I know we have folks listening to this and watching from all over the world, if my analytics are correct. I know some of you might not be aware of what Pink Shirt Day is. So I'm located here on the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations here in what we know colonially as Vancouver Island, Canada. And Pink Shirt Day was actually a movement that began on the other side of our country here in Canada, in Berwick, Nova Scotia. So the story of this day was that a grade 9 student at Central Kings Rural High School came to school wearing a pink polo shirt and was bullied for wearing that shirt. And so in response to this, there were two grade 12 students in the school that decided to take a stand, and they went to the store and bought 50 pink shirts and spread the word for classmates to wear a pink shirt the next day as a way of being in solidarity with that bullied student. And so, as the story goes, the bullied student showed up at school the next day to this sea of pink and, more importantly, a sea of support available to them. So it's really become a day here in Canada and even in other parts of the world as well to take a stand against bullying behavior. And Healthy at Work, we talk about a variety of different workplace health issues. And certainly, bullying is an issue that doesn't just affect our school communities, it affects our workplaces as well. In fact, here in British Columbia, where I'm located, we have legislation that prohibits bullying and harassment in work environments. And so, in today's episode, I wanted to talk about one of the things that we can do to help prevent bullying behavior in our workplaces. And that is learning to become more empathic. So, what is empathy? We can think about empathy as a perspective taking skill. So, what is it that another person might be feeling? What is it that they might be thinking? What is their unique point of view? Perhaps they approach things or see things in a very different way than we might. So can we stretch in our mind to try to imagine, how are they experiencing this situation? What is it that they're thinking? What is it that they're feeling? Empathy can also be compassionate in nature, meaning once we've taken that initial step to try to imagine what a person might be thinking, feeling, experiencing, we might be compelled to take some action in response, in particular to any suffering that that person might be experiencing. So, the example of how Pink Shirt Day got started is a great example of compassionate empathy. There were some students noticing, what, there is another student in the school that may be feeling humiliated, that may be feeling intimidated, that might be feeling scared. What is it that we can do to provide support or to respond to that? So, empathy, again, can be emotional, cognitive, and it may be accompanied by this sense of compassion that arises within us to do something in response to what it is that we're noticing or imagining might be happening for another person, emotionally in particular. So let's talk now about some of the benefits of empathy in the workplace. When it comes to bullying prevention, meaning how do we stop behaviors in the workplace that we know reasonably could cause people to be humiliated or intimidated? Empathy is really a powerhouse behavior that can help with that. And you might ask, well, how? So when we take time to consider how our actions might impact a person or whether we would appreciate certain types of treatment, certain behaviors, that can, for some of us, cause us to make different choices in terms of how we communicate and how we interact with others. If we're really taking into consideration what another person might be experiencing or could experience as a result of our own actions. And as humans, we're really neurobiologically wired for making this type of empathic connection with other human beings. We are mammals, we are social creatures, we are not intended to go through life isolated and alone. In fact, one of the most powerful ways as humans that we regulate our nervous systems is through co-regulation, through experiencing soothing and connection from other people. So, empathy, incredibly powerful behavior, and I wanted to do an episode around this specifically on healthy at work because I think that many of us want to be empathic. We want to show up well in the workplace for our colleagues, the people that we're working alongside. And yet we might be in our best intentions in trying to be supportive, engaging in behaviors that are actually not quite empathy. And I'm going to give you some examples. I'll actually give you five today, five behaviors that are intended to be supportive and helpful and useful, but don't often land that way from folks on the receiving end of these behaviors. And so my hope is by the end of our episode today, you have a better sense of what to look out for if you're trying to increase your skills around emotional intelligence and empathy in the workplace, and therefore, again, create a kinder, more supportive workplace environment. So, the first thing to be on the lookout for, one of these behaviors that might be an attempt to be empathic, but probably is not going to land that way, is sympathy and pity. So, this is when we actually feel really bad for somebody. Um, but that's sort of where it stops. So, an example of this, maybe a colleague of yours has made a mistake that they feel really embarrassed about. So, if we are engaging in pitying behavior or sympathetic behavior, we're really focused on, it's bad that this happened. We're focusing on regarding the person through that lens of the mistake instead of as a whole person, that could be having a variety of different feelings, right? Maybe the person is embarrassed, maybe they're experiencing shame, and we kind of join them in those feelings. Um, and there could be other things that that person is feeling as well. Maybe they feel hopeful that they're able to make it right or turn the situation around, for example. But we, as the person trying to provide support and care, are kind of hyper focused on the terribleness of the situation at hand. So when we do that, we kind of don't allow space for any other emotions that the person could be experiencing, right? Maybe they're not only feeling bad about it, maybe there's some hope or there's other feelings that can accompany what is going on there. So be on the lookout for pity. And this is where we are saying things like, "Oh, that's terrible. How horrible. I'm so sorry that this happened to you." It's almost like we're joining that person in the catastrophizing of, their particular situation. So, let's be mindful around that. It might be an attempt to be supportive, but often doesn't land that way. The second thing to be on the lookout for that, again, might be a real effort to try to be supportive and be caring, but doesn't quite land as empathy, is fixing and problem solving. And so, I raise my hand as somebody that does this too. I'm a spouse, I'm a parent. When the people I care about are suffering, I want to try to make it right, right? But often that is more about my own distress and discomfort than it is actually trying to be there, right, for the other person. So, what does this sound like? It's when we really rush to offering solutions to, difficulties, to problems, or even to emotions. So let's stick with that example of, you have a colleague that has made a mistake, and perhaps what they're feeling is embarrassment and shame and regret or anxiety about what they've done, right? When we rush right to the solutions, so maybe you could make it right by doing XYZ, or this is how you fix your mistake, we're doing a couple things. One, we are denying that person the opportunity to come up with the solutions to their own problems, right? We're not really seeing their agency, their wholeness as a human, because we're rushing in and we're assuming that we know better than they know around what to do with this, right? So we're also taking that on as our responsibility, which it is not. So that's the first thing we have to look out for with this example here. Second of all, we're rushing right through the emotional experience. How many of you listening or watching out there have actually made a mistake and you did feel some guilt or shame or regret from that? And it actually caused you to learn something, or it caused you to actually change your behavior for the better. So when we rush to problem solving and to fixing, um, it also sort of prevents and denies the emotional experience that the other person is having, which can be incredibly valuable in terms of learning and growth as humans. So we have to be careful. Often, what's happening for us when we really rush to that fixing and problem solving piece is that we are having a very difficult time ourselves sitting in the distress of having a person in front of us who is suffering and having challenging feelings. So it's often our own emotional discomfort that drives the that rush to problem solve. So noticing that in ourselves, taking a breath. And at the end of this video, I'm going to talk about how we get back to empathy. What some of the ways that we might remedy this, or we might try something different. But be on the lookout. For rushing to problem solving, not the same thing as empathy. I love this third one. It makes me laugh because, again, it's very relatable to myself as well. I notice myself doing this, is making it about me. So if you ever had a situation where you were sharing something with somebody, in the workplace or outside of it as well, and maybe there was some emotion behind what you were sharing, and the other person connected with you through the lens of their own experience. So by saying something like, oh, me too, yes, I've had that experience as well, and this is what I did, and then suddenly the conversation has shifted over to you instead of the person who's needing care and needing support. So sometimes this is called self-referencing as well, as where we're interacting in this conversation through the lens of our experience. So instead of being focused on the person that is maybe wanting to share, we flip it back on ourselves. And again, can be very well meaning. And there's times when this behavior can be helpful. If somebody's sharing an example of like a very stigmatized experience, for example, maybe they do feel some embarrassment and shame. If we stay with that example, we've been using of making the mistake, and we say something like, oh, I've done that as well. Sometimes that person can experience a bit of relief because they realize I'm not the only one. But we have to be really careful if we're going to self-disclose something like that, that we do it very quickly. So we're in and out, as opposed to then taking over the whole conversation and it now being a whole conversation about me and the mistake that I made 10 years ago when the same thing happened to me. So we want to keep it on the person in front of us, instead of kind of hijacking the conversation over to our own experience. So be on the lookout for that one as well. Again, these are human behaviors, but behaviors that aren't quite empathy. So just keeping that in mind. Hi, it's Catherine. I just wanted to pop on here for a second to let you know that I work with people individually who are seeking support around their workplace mental health. If you're feeling exhausted, burnt out, or worried about a workplace related issue, I would love to connect to learn more about your needs and explore whether working together could be a good fit. Visit my website, www.feedthelionwellness.com, for more details or to book a free 15-minute discovery call today. Next one. Cheerleading. So, working parent over here, I can catch myself doing this, at times, and my own child will call call me out on this one, when, I'm doing it a bit too much, and that's when, we really want to encourage the person. And so we might be trying to, rush them to seeing the bright side of things. We might be, sharing a lot of words of encouragement and affirmation with them in response to something they're going through. Um, but it's not quite sticking or landing because perhaps the person's having a different kind of emotional experience. So sometimes this can feel a little bit like problem solving or fixing, by again encouraging people like, I know you're going to get through this, and look at all the other great things you've done. You're such a wonderful person. You're a good person. We use positivity to try to get people to a different place than where they actually are. So it's not that that's a bad thing to do at times, right? But it's not empathy. It's different than empathy. Empathy is meeting the person where they're at in that moment, on that day, for example. And what we find is that when we do a lot of cheerleading, we kind of miss the person, right? Unless they're also feeling incredibly positive and optimistic, and that's the emotion that they're presenting with. If somebody is feeling embarrassed, ashamed, angry, when we meet them in that cheerleading space, it feels like an emotional mismatch, right? We feel like we're not being seen and heard and understood. And one of the ways we can think about empathy is helping people feel seen and heard and understood. So watch out for a cheerleading. Um, the last one I wanted to share, because I think this one can get really tricky, actually. I know it can be tricky for me at times as well, is emotional merging. So, this is where, with our empathy, we're actually joining the person in their emotion rather than maintaining a connection to our own emotional center. So, has it ever happened to you that you were interacting with somebody, maybe as a colleague, for example, and they're presenting with a certain feeling? Maybe it's frustration or anger, for example. And the person is sharing their story. Either that is, evident through their body language that they're feeling frustrated and angry, or they're telling you that using that language and words. And suddenly you notice you're starting to feel really frustrated and angry as well. This can also happen with sadness, right? Has it ever happened that somebody was telling you a story, of loss, for example, in their life, something that they're feeling really down and sad about, and you notice that emotion starting to happen in yourself as well? Um, and again, this can be really tricky because for folks that are incredibly empathic, and I would include myself in that. Part of the way we might, notice our empathy is through our bodies, right? We might begin to tune to through others by noticing what it is that we're feeling. But there's a way in which this can become really harmful to us, right? If what is happening is that we are picking up other people's emotions and feeling those emotions as if they were our own. And they're not, right? It's important to have that sense of boundaries, being able to be with people who are in different feeling states than ourselves, and to be able to acknowledge that and know where that person, ends and where you begin. And so if you notice for yourself that you are trying to be supportive, supporting a colleague, a friend, a loved one, and you start to feel what it is that they're feeling. And I would say, again, this may happen once in a while, but when it's a pattern of behavior that you aren't able to use empathy without kind of taking on and joining the other person in the same feeling that they're happening, that's just really good information, I think, for us around strengthening up our sense of boundary between ourselves and others, knowing that, we are able to be sensitive to other people without being responsible for their feelings. And when we engage in a lot of emotional merging, we might begin to actually feel responsible for other people's feelings. Now, let's go back to the story that we began this episode with. So we were talking about a great example with Pink Shirt Day of compassionate empathy, right? We, had an example of two students noticing that, somebody could be, experiencing a sense of humiliation or shame or fear. And so, they were able to channel that into an action, right? And with compassion, we, notice suffering and then we act and we do something about it. So emotional merging is a little bit different in the sense that if we're experiencing that behavior, we might actually find ourselves quite stuck, right? Quite stuck or suddenly taking on responsibility. In a way that's not particularly healthy or useful to us. So I invite you to be on the lookout for all of these behaviors. So just quick recap, pitying and sympathy, or we're feeling really bad for the other person, fixing it. So rushing and jumping to try to solve the problem quickly for the other person, making it about me. So when we, take a person's situation, we're trying to connect with them, but only through the lens of our own experience, instead of acknowledging that the other person may be having a very different experience than us. Cheerleading, so when we're trying to really rush and encourage people through, in particular, feelings that are difficult for us that we recognize in the other person. And then emotional merging, so a bit different than compassionate empathy here, where we're really feeling, and that could be in our own bodies, the same feelings as the person that we're trying to support. And it can almost cause us to become stuck and immobilized in that, rather than truly supportive and helpful. So, what is it that we want to do instead of these behaviors if we're really trying to bring more empathy into our working relationships and our work environments? I think it's important to acknowledge that there is bias that comes with empathy. We have different lived experiences. And as I've used in some of the examples that I've just shared, we can never truly know what it's like to think another person's thoughts or feel their feelings or inhabit their bodies. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive to. And we really do that through our listening. So, what is the language another person is using to describe their experience if they're coming to you for support? Using that language, using our presence, so paying attention on purpose in the present moment to what the person is sharing. And, instead of feeding back to them, this type of kind of problem solving inquiry or um, feeling sorry for them, pitying them, catastrophizing, their situation or cheerleading them, being able to acknowledge what it is that you've heard can be incredibly powerful. Let's return to that example of making a mistake in the workplace. And, maybe somebody's describing to you that they feel some regret or shame. Being able to acknowledge that, to be able to say things like, I can see you feel a lot of regret around this. You've talked about, how you would do this differently next time. I can see this is really bothering you. I can see or I can hear that this is something you've really been thinking a lot about, and you're anxious about how your actions may have impacted other people. So don't forget the feeling words when you are using empathy in the workplace. If empathy is difficult for you, sometimes we just focus on the content of, a situation, but we miss the feeling. So if you don't know what the feeling is, it's okay to ask the person. But we may, again, reasonably know or guess what a person is feeling based on things like what is happening in their body language or other words that they've, used or said. You can always make your empathy tentative as well. How do we do that? We can frame back to the person a bit of a guess around how they might be feeling. Like, I'm imagining you could be feeling some shame around this, or, it sounds like you could be feeling guilty about what happened. This allows some room for the person that you're trying to support to disagree. Maybe that's not their experience. So rather than stating it as a fact, you state it as a hunch or a guess, and allowing the person to agree or disagree with that. So this week in Canada, as we uphold Pink Shirt Day, I really encourage you to think about those behaviors that we went through, notice them in yourselves, and see if there's an opportunity in the places that you work to engage in some good listening, and rather than rush to problem solve or fix or cheerlead, or rushing into pity, if we can practice just trying to acknowledge, what it is that the people around us are feeling, experiencing, thinking, and needing, and seeing if this helps to transform some of your relationships at work. Thanks for listening today, everybody. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for listening today. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and is not medical advice or mental health treatment. If you're struggling at work, please reach out to the supports within your workplace or community. This podcast was gratefully recorded on the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations.